Hey guys, welcome back to the final video of chapter 1. Yes, that's right, you made it until the end of the chapter. In this video today, we will be discussing methodology, the conflicts in economics, and the different points of contention. Now, economics is a very broad syllabus. It is a very broad science. There are different views that people have. You will see that in economics, people rarely agree with each other, right? Some people might say that one economic model is better, and other people might say that another economic model is better. The Cold War was essentially a battle of ideologies between communism and capitalism, between the United States of America and the former Soviet Union. So there is immense conflict between economists about the correct approach to handle an economy, the correct approach to satisfy the unlimited needs and wants of people in society. The core questions of economics always have different answers, and sometimes the situation changes the answer. So, how do we approach economic methodology? All right. Firstly, economics is a social science. It is a social science because it deals with people. It deals with the decision-making processes of people and how different factors affect the decision-making of economic agents. All right. Economics as a discipline follows the social scientific method. The social scientific method is essentially what is used to develop theories, models, and understandings. The social scientific method essentially involves about 6 steps. It's been narrowed down, but it involves 6 steps. Now, the first step is to make observations and create questions. You want to observe economic phenomena in the world, how different markets are created, how people change their spending patterns, and you want to ask, why does this happen? Why are people spending more on turkeys on Thanksgiving? Why are people spending less on ice cream when summer happens? So essentially observations, and you create the requisite questions. Now, the second step is identifying those factors which affect those observations. For example, you make the observation that you're living in Los Angeles, the summer is great, and nearby there's a person named Bob, and he sells ice cream. Bob has a business of selling ice cream, which does not really do well in winter, but when the summer comes, he makes a killing. He makes a large profit, and you don't understand why. So you ask, why does Bob make more money selling ice cream during the summer than he does during the winter? And then you identify factors. You identify that more people come to Los Angeles during the summer to make use of the beaches. And then you realize that there are more people to buy from Bob, and that the weather is very hot, and that the product that Bob sells, ice cream, cools people down. So you identify those factors, and then you hypothesize. Hypothesis formulation is this third step. You hypothesize, essentially you take an educated guess. That's what making a hypothesis is. You hypothesize or make an educated guess that the summer and the temperature as well as the population increase are responsible for Bob's increased business income during the summer. Then you make assumptions about preferences, that people like ice cream during the summer because it cools them down, that people like Bob because he's close to the beaches. They can have ice cream and get a suntan at the same time. And then you test those hypotheses, all right? You make a similar environment, perhaps in Florida. You set up a stall, you wait there until summer, and then you compare the business activity in the summer as compared to winter. And then you compare the results between perhaps an ice cream stall in Florida with a colder state like Minnesota. And then you see if the results match, if the results that you are getting emulate reality. If your results, such as your stall in Florida, having more business and more income during the summer because of these factors, if your reality is corroborated by the data you're getting, then congratulations, your observation is correct and your hypothesis is correct. That is essentially the social scientific method. That is how economists, the biggest economists, the greatest thinkers ever, make their entire theories. They make assumptions, they identify factors, they hypothesize, they make assumptions, they test data, and they compare results to ensure that their hypothesis is correct. Now, what if their hypothesis isn't correct? Then they would go back to making observations, reframing their questions, identifying new possible factors, all right, creating new assumptions, then testing in a new manner, all right, and then comparing the new data sets. Essentially, it's a cycle which is guaranteed to lead to success in the long run, all right? That is essentially the economic methodology that everyone primarily uses. There are more complex forms of research and there are more complex forms of thinking, but this is what it boils down to. This 6-step method is the core and heart of economic research. Moving on, economists are faced with a variety of decisions, okay? The first of which is the positive or normative dilemma. What is this positive or normative? Okay, positive questions or positive statements rather. Positive statements are those which reflect reality. Now, suppose we are in 2020. Now, the positive statement would be that there is large amounts of unemployment because of the coronavirus. The coronavirus has caused businesses to shut down because there is threat from the virus and no one is coming. That is a positive statement. A positive statement reflects reality. All right? A positive concept always takes into account reality and is always based on facts. A normative concept, on the other hand, is what ought to be. A normative concept or a normative theory is a theory which ideates on as to what the ideal situation is to be. A normative observation would be that since it's 2020, the unemployment rate needs to be lower. And that people need to have more income and that people need to have more income stability. It's what ought to be. Positive and normative questions have very different applications. Positive questions help us identify and test hypotheses, right? Because they reflect reality and we want our hypothesis to reflect reality. But normative questions help us decide on what policy we want to make. Governments use normative questions to identify which policies to enact. If there is large amounts of unemployment, the unemployment should be less. Thus, the government will enact a policy where it spends more on production of different highways, roads, buildings to create jobs. Essentially, normative is for policymaking and positive is for research. You can think of this in that crude manner, right? Another core question is model building, right? How do we want to construct our model? Do we want to construct it in a positive way, which reflects reality? Or do we want to build a normative model, which displays how society can perfectly operate and how society ought to operate? That makes sense? And that is essentially, that leads us to the third type of core question that economists face, which is the dilemma between microeconomics, macroeconomics, and the global economy. Can the model rather operate only in the microeconomic realm, which is the single economy, or can it operate in the macroeconomic realm as well? Or not even that, can it operate on the global economy using the entire concept of multiple economies formulating one? This is essentially the core questions every economist asks. Moving on, we see that we have been talking a lot about models, right? The production possibilities model, creating models which emulate reality, all right? How do we make models at the end of the day? Now, firstly, a model emulates real-world outcomes. If it makes any other assumptions that does not reflect the reality, it is a failed model and it needs to be remade. A model also assumes the ceteris paribus assumption. It assumes that the variables that are changing within the model, such as on the x-axis and the y-axis, are the only ones that are changing, and everything else stays the same. Consumer preference, income, the weather, everything else stays the same, because that is what allows a model to reflect reality. It allows us to see what happens when two variables interact with each other. Now, that is essentially what models are supposed to do. They're supposed to assume that everything else stays the same and emulate or recreate real world outcomes, right? But should the model be for positive or normative economics? Okay. As I said before, positive economics is concerned with making observations of facts and providing definite answers. Every positive statement, such as the unemployment rate is 57% in Venezuela currently, or that there is high amounts of inflation within the Chinese economy, it provides definite answers and it is objective, it is data driven. But normative economics concerns itself with making judgments, with making value judgments about what is economically just, what is equitable, and what the economic situation ought to be. While positive economics is objective, it only has one correct answer. Normative economics is relatively subjective, right? And we see that economics as a whole just gets to be more subjective as we move on to different theories. Because normative economics, people can have different interpretations of what ought to be, of what the economic situation should be. Thus, we see that normative economics is subjective. It depends on the person, it depends on the economist that is making those assumptions. However, both are interdependent and both are related. Positive economics creates recreation of the situation. It allows normative economics to concern itself with observation of positive economics to decide what ought to be. Positive economics provides the data for normative economics, and normative economics essentially influences positive economics. It is a circle, it is an interdependent circle, which again shows that both economies, all right, both types of economic thinking are closely related and complement each other. So that's another IB core concept, interdependence. And we move on to the final thing, the points of contention. Because normative economics is subjective, there are multiple differing opinions about what ought to be. There are various points of contention between economists. Amartya Sen, a Nobel laureate, believes that higher government intervention should be there. But Adam Smith believes that there should be minimal government intervention and that the government should not concern itself with economic undertakings. So we see that there are a number of areas where economists disagree. And let's have a look at some. The first point of contention is economic growth versus economic development. This is an age-old argument. Economic growth refers to increase in the gross domestic product. Economic growth generally means that the output produced by an economy increases year on year. And the logic behind that is if output increases, more people are required to produce it, and there are more jobs. And essentially, if there are more jobs, there are more income, and everyone benefits. But economic development believes in increasing of overall well-being, the financial security, the health and well-being, and the increasing of human capital, all right, developing human capital. So doesn't this happen by itself when economic growth happens? That is the point of contention. Does economic growth lead to development, or does economic development lead to growth? This is the first point of contention. Furthermore, we see that the second point of contention is sustainability. If resources are used efficiently, there's minimal wastage and that there's enough to go around, right? But what if we are using resources too rapidly? Are we leaving enough resources in the world for the future generations, or are we being selfish? This is another very big point of contention. Should the government intervene to make economic resource usage more sustainable, or should the private players be left to sort out sustainability on themselves? And the third point is government intervention itself. We have seen government intervention be successful, such as the Great Depression of 1929. The American government intervened and it spent more and more on highway projects, the Hoover Dam, buildings in New York City to create jobs. And by 1936, the Great Depression was almost gone, right? But we also see where government intervention has failed, all right? Such as the USSR. The government intervened in nearly every economic decision-making process, and finally, the USSR just simply collapsed in 1991. Thus, we see that economists disagree a lot on if the government, if and when and where a government should intervene, or even if they should intervene at all, right? So we come to the final point of contention, which is the battle between efficiency and equity. Efficiency refers to using resources in an optimal manner, whereas equity is concerned with what is just, what should be. People should have an access to equal rights and equal economic rights. Everyone should control the same amount of economic resources. But efficiency only argues that only people who can produce should produce, and only people who have the money to buy products should consume. So we see that there is a battle between efficiency and equity. Now, these points of contentions will remain for the longest time ever. But I want you to do a little research. Where do you, as an economic student, stand? Do you believe in economic growth, or do you believe in economic development? Do you believe that sustainability is the job of the government or the responsibility of private players? Do you believe that government intervention is justified? Or do you believe that the government should just mind its own business? And finally, do you believe that efficiency should be the primary objective of governments and economies, or should it be equity? Why am I asking you to research this? Why am I asking you to introspect and look at where you stand? It's because when you start writing answers, when you start practicing for your boards, you will have to give your own opinion. And as a former IB student, I did a little thinking. I liked the idea of free market capitalism more than I liked the ideologies of socialism. And I could thus put forward my arguments and argue in a certain point, in a certain way, which, well, rendered to my beliefs. The IB wants your opinions. There are no set rules or no set answers for an IB question. There are different approaches, and that is essentially what you should capitalize on. Look at where you stand and then frame your answer around that question. All right? There will always be different approaches, and there will always be different understandings of different topics. So that is essentially it. I want you to figure out where you stand on these very contentious issues. And congratulations, you are done with chapter 1. Guys, you just survived the initial introduction to IB economics. And I'm sure this is a lot of information at first, all right? So take your time, understand the concepts, all right? Look at where you stand on these, how you can frame answers, and also utilize the previous year's IB economics topic-wise past papers and do questions, because practice makes perfect, or at the very least, it removes the imperfections. Do topic-wise past papers. They are available here and they're available on external websites as well. So ensure that you have a solid backing in this subject before we move on to the next chapter. In chapter 2, we will be discussing the evolution of economic thinking, how different economists have influenced our way and understanding of modern day economics. Until then, and until we start chapter 2, I can't wait to see you guys, but good night, goodbye, and stay safe.